Hello everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this Monday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm Dave Percy, meteorologist with the National Weather Service, and I'll be hosting today's show. Up first, hazardous weather graphic. Flood watch continues there. Looks like the north side of the central eastern Brooks Range there, south of the greater Fairbanks area. And then down over the southern panhandle, Prince of Wales Island and Ketchikan, Annette, Metlakatla, they're still under the influence of a high wind watch, which is out through Tuesday evening, the way it looks at this point in time. And moving on to, again, no other watches, warnings, or advisories out for anywhere else in the state, just the two I mentioned. And satellite imagery. Storm system off the southeast coast moving in and slowly weakening today. Looks like the center drifting right over the top of Sitka, more or less, with heaviest precipitation occurring down over the southern panhandle, where 24-hour amounts Ketchikan had over 1.5 inches, and some other areas near or just under 1 inch, with lighter amounts up to the north toward Juneau and into Lynn Canal Glacier Bay. And then the clouds tend to dissipate out, and it was another very sunny day over much of interior Alaska. Just some high stuff dissipating this afternoon over the southeast interior, Copper River Basin, and then the Arctic coast, eastern Arctic coast. Still some areas reporting winds gusting out of the west of 45 miles an hour, with snow and blowing snow occurring there this afternoon, with that series of disturbances passing from west to east in the Arctic jet. Up in that area with much better conditions back to the west. Snowfall as far west as Point Barrow today, and then it just kind of flurries and clouds and a lot less wind over the western Arctic coast. And then light snow with cold air coming through the Bering Strait. Low clouds producing flurries actually for St. Lawrence Island from the Bering Strait, Teller, Tin City, those areas. And down below freezing again, colder air, but just overcast skies for the Pribilofs, and then some showers with weak disturbance over the eastern Aleutians. Look like they're trying to pull off to the south, and the next front spreading some increased wind and moisture into the far western Aleutians, but it looks like at this point winds are under gale force. On the chart today, you can see that next system pushing into the western Aleutian areas with a warm front and the rain. Winds are on the increase, gusts to about 40 miles an hour at Chimay-Attu. Otherwise, a weak disturbance cutting through the surface high over the Bering Sea, and the other one bringing those showers into the Fox Islands, and generally just cloudy skies and isolated showers far western Alaska Peninsula. You can see it clears out right around Cold Bay on up the peninsula. Kodiak Island, sunshine today, as well as much of the interior areas. And then a series of lows traveling from southwest to northeast, one moving into the Yukon, weakening today, another one, as we saw, approaching the coast this afternoon with the heaviest rain and strongest winds down to the south, with those gusts 40-60 miles per hour, these passing system that comes through, then they lighten up, and then the Arctic front there up along the eastern and central Arctic coast with the snow and blowing snow there, and then a few flurries over the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island. Again, the forecast for tonight, we'll see that winds diminish on the Arctic coast on the east side there, but chances of snow continue over the north slope, just flurries in toward the Brooks Range. And light amounts of snow along the eastern Arctic coast as continued frontal action hangs just off the coast there through tonight. High pressure holds over the eastern Bering Sea and should lose the showers over the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutian areas, and also wind should become light and variable over the Pribilofs, and with some clearing possible also for the Fox Islands. And wind is on the increase for Adak late tonight, but the rain should stay to your west until tomorrow. And another low pressure area actually weakening off the north coast there of the Panhandle, so it'll stay windy and wet with the strongest winds and heaviest precipitation over the southern areas. And then farther to the southwest, you can see the next system moving or developing, and will also move up to the northeast. And we'll see for tomorrow, that moves up to just west of the Queen Charlotte Islands, and that front pushes up into the southern Panhandle, so another increase in the wind and precipitation once again there. And again, the high wind watch out, potentially seeing winds may pick up to 60 miles an hour, possibly, but as you can see, the gradient quite slack over the northern Panhandle, just a chance of rain there. Another sunny day, southern central Alaska, again, south central Alaska, nothing but sun from Prince William Sound, central Copper River Basin westward out to the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, as well as the northern Bering Sea, Seward Peninsula. And Arctic front kind of drops southward now over the north slope, so periods of snow continue there, and that frontal system weakens as it pushes eastward to the central Aleutians for breezy conditions and periods of rain, IFR conditions, and a little more energetic trough produces a little stronger winds, mostly south of the western Aleutians though. And moving ahead to the outlook for Wednesday, looks like just still much weaker low pressure areas now affecting the Panhandle, so mostly cloudy skies with light rain and showers, and winds not much of a problem for the day on Wednesday. And frontal boundary up there over the Brooks Range loses the moisture and weakens as it crosses the crest of the mountains up there. Looking mostly clear, even along the Arctic coast there, with high pressure over the Mackenzie River Bay area. Light winds, sunshine, northern Bering Sea, all of the western part of the state, Seward Peninsula southward to Kodiak Island, once again, Alaska Peninsula, and just that really washed out front, bringing chance of showers into the eastern Aleutians. Winds not a factor at all. A little breezier out over the western Aleutians, just south of that low center for Shimmy and Attu, but maybe 15-25 miles an hour showers for Adak and Atka. And for the eastern interior, actually the 40-mile country, upper Tanana Valley, look for a better chance of rain and snow showers, with clouds increasing over the Copper River Basin, possibly into the Susitna Valley, as well as western Cook Inlet, the way it looks at this point in time. And from there, looking at lows tonight, single numbers for the Brooks Range, teens North Slope and Arctic Coast, teens and mid-20s Central Interior, and 25 to 35 for southern Alaska, lows upper 30s and lower 40s for the Panhandle. And we're seeing mostly lower 30s there for the Alaska Peninsula, upper 30s Kodiak Island area, upper 20s for the Pribilofs, and lows in the mid-30s for the central and western Aleutians. And for Tuesday afternoon, highs in the teens, struggling to make 20 degrees there for the Arctic coast, and 15 to 25 for the North Slope, upper 20s, lower 30s through the Brooks Range, and near 20 for Kotzebue and the northern Seward Peninsula, mid to upper 20s, southern Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island, lower 30s for the Pribilofs, upper 30s for your highs for Adak, Atka, and Shemya, lower 40s, eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, warming into the lower 50s for Bristol Bay, highs back into the 50s, south central Alaska, 40s in the Tanana Valley, 45 to 50 for the Copper River Basin, upper 40s to near 50 there for the Panhandle. And for the lows, Tuesday morning, near zero, just above for the Brooks Range, otherwise teens, 20s, and 30s everywhere else, followed by highs again, 50s, southern Alaska, teens and lower 20s up along the Arctic coast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Okay, looking at flying weather for tomorrow morning, IFR, Arctic coast, North Slope, marginal up to the crest of the Brooks Range, then VFR south of there through the central eastern interior, right into the Gulf of Alaska and Kodiak Island. Panhandle, though, we've got marginal VFR over the inside waters with IFR along the north and central coast and across the southern areas, Prince of Wales Island to Stewart to Dixon Entrance and up the eastern border. Out in the Bering Sea, IFR, north side of the Alaska Range, north shores of the eastern Aleutians, all of the Pribilofs up to the Bering Strait, and another batch out there with the front pushing into the southwest Bering Sea. And moving on to the afternoon, still IFR hanging over the central and eastern North Slope and the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, otherwise marginal VFR from the northwest interior on out to the western Arctic coast, and marginal for St. Lawrence Island. Narrow band of IFR just east of the Pribilofs, and a couple more bands of IFR farther to the west and southwest, with the third one approaching the western Aleutians, otherwise VFR. Southern three-quarters of the state, including Kodiak Island, Prince William Sound, IFR southern panhandle, and the central and south coast, marginal to the north. Moving on to Wednesday morning, we've got marginal VFR over the inside waters again, and IFR down south on the eastern border. VFR from Yakutat eastward all the way across the North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island, southwest coast of Nunivak Island, and much of the southern interior. Then pick up some marginal VFR north of the White Mountains and up to and south of the Yukon River. And then the Brooks Range on out to the Arctic coast is pretty marginal. IFR areas of out over the Bering Sea. And from there, Wednesday afternoon, narrow band of IFR just reaching the Pribilof Islands on down across mainly Unalaska Island, slowly improving over Umak Island. Central Aleutians marginal, another band of IFR with the front out over the western Aleutians. Otherwise, the interior, not too bad. We've got marginal VFR, though, showing up over the eastern Tanana Valley, or upper Tanana Valley, 40-mile country, central eastern Alaska range, trying to spill into the Wrangell Mountains of the northeast Copper River Basin. Otherwise, another sunny day over southern Alaska and much of the interior as well. No change over the panhandle with marginal and IFR conditions. Moving on to passes. Anatuvik, marginal VFR, IFR northern entrance, Adigan IFR. Like Clark and Merrill, VFR, rainy, same forecast. Salines visibility is unlimited for Windy, Isabel, and Mentasta. Tanita, good VFR day once again. And Portage, clear skies. Chilkoot and White looks kind of IFR, or will be IFR. Freezing levels at the surface, all the way up to the Russian coast there over the western Bering Sea, but down to near the Pribilofs and southward there, trying to get into western Bristol Bay, but not quite reaching the Alaska Peninsula. 2,000 feet over the southern interior, and the Panhandle, extreme southeast coast, so to the south there, looking about 4,000 feet. Moving on to icing, we'll see we've got considerable moderate below 14,000 feet there for the southeast coast, and another area of considerable moderate rime icing below 12,000 feet for the central Aleutians. Otherwise, the Arctic coast north slope, just some isolated moderate, mostly on the light side, areas of below 8,000 feet there. The remainder of the state icing free, and the jet stream showing a good north-northwest jet here, swinging into the Arctic coast and across the north slope. 90 knots hitting the coast and then falling back to about 60 to 80 knots as it crosses the Brooks Range and really drops off over the southern interior. Then we've got easterly flow over the northern Bering Sea, starting out on the Yukon Delta about 40 knots, picking up to 65 knots. The strong jet, Pacific jet, just south of the Panhandle, in across the Queen Charlotte Islands there out of the southwest. And 9,000-foot winds, again, strongest coming into the Panhandle or just to the south there, 45 to 60 knots out of the south up into the southern southeast coast, and another jet max out there over the central Bering Sea, only at about 40 knots out of the south, ahead of that southwest Bering low. And north to northwest flow continues over the northern interior from the Arctic coast. 3,000 feet, southerlies 45 knots for the central Aleutians, 40 knots for the Panhandle. Turbulence, moderate chop, southern 2/3 of the southeast coast, central Aleutians, and far western Aleutians.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. As you well know, you can get forecast information for any day of the week. Today, tonight, tomorrow, out to 6 or 7 days. It includes the high and low temperature, the wind direction, the chance of rain or snow in your part of Alaska. But did you know that there is information available to forecast out to 2 weeks? So the question is, how would you use that information? And here to answer that question today and tell us a lot more about climate services from the U.S. National Weather Service Alaska region is Rick Toman. He's the program manager for the Climate Science and Services. And Rick, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
How would we use information that is out to 2 weeks instead of just the high and low and the chance of rain?
Well, Dave, as we move out in time, of course, forecasts become more uncertain. So as we move into that second week from now, we're not looking at specific highs or lows or precipitation amounts at any given place. What we can do with the state of the science at this point is get a handle on patterns. So we can say things like increased chances for stormy weather in the Bering Sea in 2 weeks, or we've been in a cold weather pattern, looks like 8 to 10 days from now, that pattern's going to change. Those are the kind of forecasts that we can currently make in that second week.
So you're increasing lead time for perhaps big or small weather events and telling us the likelihood of maybe more coastal storms or wind events in some areas?
Those are the kinds of things that that we hope to be able to let Alaskans know in the second week forecast. And if you have an activity or an event that you would find that kind of advance notice useful, whether it's moving stuff off of the beach, whether to go out hunting or to come back from camp, those kind of decisions, the week 2 provides the opportunity for you to get a handle on that kind of information.
Okay. What other type of weather impacts that we're familiar with might Alaskans use climate services for?
Well, in the forecast realm, we can go provide some information from this week 2, say the 8 to 14 day period, on out to the monthly and even seasonal time scale. Now, those monthly seasonal forecasts are still kind of just really very much pattern dependent, and the amount of detail that we can provide at this point is still pretty limited. Generally, indications of how temperature and precipitation will fall in maybe above normal, below normal kind of range. But in the week 2 period, we can be considerably more specific than that as far as the general patterns and really the impacts on Alaskans.
Okay, so we would be talking about generalizations there that would tell us that the period might be more stormy, might be more hot, more dry, more cold, and situations like that.
That's correct. So we're not going to be able to say in which community, for instance, there's the threat of coastal flooding, but we can often be able to tell we're moving into a pattern that would be conducive to big Bering Sea storms. So if you're in an area that could potentially impact you, you'll want to pay attention to the weather forecast.
Okay. Now, every day and every hour of the day, the National Weather Service is working on a forecast for the next day. But how do you start your forecast process for that extended period that goes out beyond 7 days?
Well, the way things work right now, we start off with the expected general flow pattern for Alaska and the whole world, really, and then we narrow that down to Alaska. So we start off with the basic computer model forecast. There's quite a few different computer models that we look at, bring those together. And then another important part of that is we attempt to assess the confidence. The reality is often 2 weeks away, the computer models are very divergent. They have lots of different solutions, and that's an indication that we don't have much confidence. But when we see more agreement in that time frame, and when that agreement is a pattern that will be potentially very impactful for Alaska or is a big change from what we've been in, that's when we can then take that expected pattern. We have computer models forecasting it. We've assessed the confidence. Now we can move that forward. How, using our experience as Alaskan weather forecasters, how does that typically play out for Alaska? So is this a stormy pattern for the Bering Sea? Is this an extra rainy period for Southeast? Is this the kind of pattern that generates strong winds potentially in the Anchorage Bowl? Is this a deep cold pattern for the interior? All of those are the kind of things that we're looking at in these large-scale patterns. That's very different than telling you that the winds on 10 days from now are going to be gusting to 120 on the hillside. We're looking for patterns, not the very specific information that the Weather Service will then hone in on as the event gets closer.
So the idea is to keep the 5, 6, 7 day forecast the same, where you are getting the standard high and low temperature and the chance of wind or rain, but further out you get a broad general forecast, but as the time gets closer to that event, we'll get a lot more specific.
That's correct.
Okay, very good. So how can people use this information if I am out in the bush and I want to see, is a coastal storm expected in my region, or is a chance for that improving over the next 2 to 3 weeks? Where could I go to get information like that?
When we see that potentially impactful or a big change in the weather is coming 8 to 14 days out, typically we will start to highlight that on the Weather Service Facebook site. We might produce a YouTube video highlighting that, linking that on our Facebook site. So often at this point, we don't have much to say in that because we're really looking for those forecasts of opportunities. But one thing we can say very likely as we go through the next 2 or 3 years, there'll be more and more of this kind of forecast information available in that week 2 time frame.
Okay, and something that emergency managers and city planners and folks in villages might be interested in keeping an eye out for, looking for that information to be headlined, whether that's on social media or perhaps through the National Weather Service channels there to get information from you to make better plans a little bit longer term and make better preparations in the event that things become a little bit more unsettled.
Absolutely. Climate Services with the National Weather Service Alaska region is talking to the state of Alaska every week, apprising them of that 2-week outlook. And on the social media side, we are working to keep Alaskans informed so that when we think we have some confidence in a high impact or a big change, that's the best way right now for folks to find out about that. Twitter, Facebook, so stay tuned to your National Weather Service.
Very good, a developing program. Rick Thoman with the National Weather Service Alaska region. He's a Climate Science and Services Program Manager. Thanks so much for joining us again, Rick, and I hope to have you back again soon.
Great, thanks, Dave.
For another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. We'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back now. I'm meteorologist Carrie Hazley with a look at marine weather conditions across the state of Alaska. Up first, a look at the sea ice edge. We've got the colorful map here on your screen, but the areas of note are the areas in gray. Those are shore-fast ice, and we have less than 80% coverage in the areas with the shore-fast ice. Also, areas of lesser coverage show up there in blue and green on your map. It's the areas in red where we have the greatest concentration of sea ice. So we are continuing to see some erosion of the ice, particularly on south-facing coasts. And we will continue to see some erosion of the sea ice as we go through the days through the week. As far as marine weather conditions go across the rest of the state, let's start by taking a look at conditions for your Tuesday down over the Panhandle, where we see pretty noteworthy waves and winds on the offshore waters with a significant weather system. Out in the Gulf of Alaska, we see waves ranging from about 11 feet up towards Yakutat to 17 feet down in the southern area of our coastal waters, and then pretty gusty winds primarily out of the east in the offshore areas, 25 knots up towards Yakutat, 45 knots in the southern part of the area. In the interior channels, we do see a lessening of the winds and the waves, although they're around Ketchikan, Dixon Entrance. We will see winds tomorrow out of the southeast up to about 35 knots, 10-foot seas, and then lessening quite a bit as you move further north through the interior channels. Into the day on Wednesday, we do see a bit of a drop-off in the winds in most places, although we actually see a bit of an increase in the wave heights. 19 feet for the southern part of the coastal waters, up to about 10 feet once you get closer to Yakutat. Winds ranging between 30 and 15, depending on where you're at, higher further south in the offshore waters, and then in the interior waters there. Winds ranging between 15 and 30 knots there as well. Moving around to south central Alaska for Tuesday, we start with a look at Cook Inlet. Winds out of the northeast up to about 10 knots and seas up to about 2 feet. Moving around into the north part of the Gulf there, we do see some stronger waves up to about 11 feet in the Cordova area, and then starting to lessen as you move further west. Winds primarily out of the northeast and in most places staying fairly light just out in the northern part of the Gulf where we see the strongest. Into the day on Wednesday, some lessening of the winds in the Gulf, and then over the Cook Inlet area, winds still out of the northeast primarily, although a bit of northwesterly winds across the central part of Cook Inlet, up to about 10 knots with seas to 2 feet, and then some lessening of those seas out in the North Gulf of Alaska. Over towards the Alaska Peninsula now, let's take a look at Bristol Bay for Tuesday morning. 15-knot wind out of the west, 2-foot seas, and then we see those 15-knot winds kind of persist around the entire area. So down towards Cold Bay, 15 knots out of the northwest, and the northwest winds to about 15 knots on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula as well. When we get into the day on Wednesday, we see a bit more of a shift in the wind direction, coming out of the southwest now over Bristol Bay, and then due west over towards the Cold Bay area, but still relatively light as far as winds go, 10 to 15 knots in most areas here. Further out the Aleutian chain on Tuesday, we will look for winds to have primarily a southerly component to them, with the strongest winds and waves on the Pacific side of the Aleutian chain, out towards Shemya, 30 knots out of the southwest, with seas up to 13 feet coming around towards Nikolsky, 20 knots with 6 feet out of the south. And then into the day on Wednesday, we see a pretty noteworthy increase in both winds and waves, particularly in the far western part of the Aleutians. Out towards Shemya now, 35 knots out of the due west as a frontal system pushes into the area, with seas up to about 22 feet, some places where we could see them a bit higher than that over towards Kiska. Moving around towards Adak, we do start to see on Wednesday a bit of a decrease then in the winds and the waves. Out of the southwest now, 25 knots with seas ranging between 10 and 13 feet. Now up towards the ice edge for Tuesday, winds along the ice edge, primarily out of the north. Once you get a bit further north, more out of the west, but fairly weak, 10 knots. And then in open waters along the ice edge, we will look for a northeasterly flow, winds up to about 10 knots and seas around 3 feet. And then into the day on Wednesday, some increase in the wave height as the frontal boundary does push its way into the Bering Sea. So along the ice edge, winds out of the east up to about 25 knots. Over the ice edge itself, more winds out of the north and a bit weaker. Now up onto the Arctic coast, over towards Prudhoe Bay, we see winds out of the west. No waves to speak of, but the winds there are going to be up to about 20 knots. And then over towards Utqiagvik and on down towards Cape Lisburne there, winds up to about 15 knots and out of the northeast in most places, west as you get further down the coast. And then into the day on Wednesday, we do see fairly light winds in most places up over the Arctic, 10 knots in most places, and then variable in direction out of the east along much of the west coast.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.